I'd like to welcome you to our luncheon program today. And let me just say, from the American Constitution Society's point of view, we put on a whole variety of amazing programs, as so many of you are aware. We have wonderful scholars. We have elected officials. We have people who are active in public policy in so many different ways. But I think I speak for all of us in saying that this event today, this luncheon, is a particularly memorable and meaningful to all of us. We are so delighted to welcome two extremely special guests, the Honorable John Lewis and Pulitzer Prize winner Taylor Branch, for our Road to Democracy discussion. Congressman John Lewis, who's the representative of Georgia's 5th Congressional District. He's often called one of the most courageous persons the civil rights movement ever produced. John Lewis has dedicated his life to protecting human rights, securing civil liberties, and building what he calls the beloved community in America. His dedication to the highest ethical standards and moral principles has won him the admiration of his colleagues on both sides of the aisle in Congress. Speaker Nancy Pelosi has called Congressman Lewis the conscience of the U.S. Congress. And Roll Call has said, John Lewis is a genuine American hero and moral leader who commands widespread respect in the chamber. Taylor Branch is an author and public speaker best known for his landmark narrative history of the civil rights era, America in the King Years. The trilogy's first book, Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 1963, won the Pulitzer Prize and numerous other awards in 1989. Two successive volumes also gained critical and popular success. Pillar of Fire, America in the King Years, 1963 to 1965, and At Canaan's Edge, America in the King Years, 1965 to 1968. The trilogy, which required more than 24 years of intensive research, has been compared to epic histories such as Shelby Foote's The Civil War and Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. It is both insightful and definitive. So please join me on this very special occasion in welcoming Congressman Lewis and Taylor Branch in what is going to be a fascinating and illuminating discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you and welcome. I heard the morning panel. It was about law. We're going to talk mostly about history, about the past, and about the future. By way of very brief introduction before we talk about how the Voting Rights Act was born, and John was there and made it happen, I want to just give a couple of introductory remarks that it's a great privilege to be here discussing with you an issue of such import with someone like Congressman Lewis. We go pretty far back. I was born in the 5th District, which he represents now. I didn't know him when we were growing up and when he was in the movement, but I was at Chapel Hill as a sophomore when he was marching at Selma. Less than 3 years later, we met in 1968 when I was, politely speaking, the gopher, the 21-year-old gopher for the challenge delegation that challenged Lester Maddox at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. John was a member of that delegation, too. I won't go into many stories except to say he is not known for some of his true gifts, which is that he's a wonderful dancer, among other things. Then the very next year, 1969, I worked for John at the Voter Education Project out of Atlanta. So we go back 40 years, and we're looking back a little beyond that to the period when he was a few years ahead of me on the front lines of the civil rights movement, and I was a stupefied student at Chapel Hill trying to figure out what all of this meant. Background on the history itself, and then I want to turn it over to John and get into dialogue about how it happened. From Dr. King's point of view, the Voting Rights Act was to some degree, a defining career moment. He was goaded into the Voting Rights Act. He didn't want to go to Selma. In the end of 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Civil Rights Act, which was only just passed. It was still under court challenge whether it was constitutional, outlawing segregation. Two of John's friends from Nashville, Diane Nash and James Bevel, had been goading Dr. King for a year to mount a campaign for a Voting Rights Act as an answer to the Birmingham church bombing in 1963. They got on his case. Most of his staff wanted to celebrate the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for about 20 years of chicken dinners and testimonials. He was there in December in Oslo receiving the Nobel Prize. He went to jail in Selma, Dr. King did, in January, the very next month. He went against the will, the concerted will, and the foot dragging of his whole staff to do that. In my view, this was the birth of the downward king, the king who said it's not about raising up the movement, it's about catching up with the people left behind. People could not vote in Alabama. Bevel and Diane Nash's rationale was that crimes like the Birmingham church bombing could not happen and be sloughed off if black people had voting rights in Alabama. And so they designed a plan to paralyze Alabama until it granted Voting Rights Act. That's the birth of it. Dr. King took that lead, started in January. By Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, the Selma movement had been marching daily for 2 months, right at 2 months. The Voting Rights Act and the voting rights movement in Selma was also controversial, not just within Dr. King's camp, but within SNCC's camp, where John was the chairman of SNCC, the students who had spearheaded the sit-ins, the freedom rides, all the movements up to and including Freedom Summer, just the summer before. Many of John's colleagues did not want to take part in it, saw it as Dr. King's movement. There was a lot of controversy within SNCC about whether to go. John marched anyway. He went to jail in Selma several times before the Bloody Sunday March, which galvanized the nation on March 7th, 1965. He led that march as the result of his own personal determination against the will of his own organization. Most people in SNCC did not want him to take part in that march. And I think that's a good place to open on the participants' point of view. This is a movement at a place when the country is still in shock, absorbing what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 means for segregation, for employment, for equal employment, for women, all these things. And here this movement is way out in the vanguard on a new movement for Voting Rights Act, divided internally. There's a plan to march from Selma to Montgomery. And John Lewis stayed up all night with his people about whether or not to march. John, remember that moment for us a little bit, because that's when most of the country comes awake on the issue of Voting Rights Act in Selma.
Well, thank you very much, Taylor. I must say to you that I'm delighted, pleased, and honored to be here with you and the American Constitution Society. You've been a wonderful friend, wonderful, gifted writer, historian, and you've made a lasting contribution to the literature of the civil rights movement and our own struggle, the whole struggle in America. And we're deeply indebted to you. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
I want to go back a little bit, Taylor, if I might.
All right.
If I might. You may recall, maybe you were just a little bit too young. Maybe not. When I spoke at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, 47 years ago, when I was working on my speech, I was reading a copy of the New York Times, and I saw a group of black women in Southern Africa carrying signs saying, "One man, one vote." So in my March on Washington speech, I said something like, "One man, one vote is the African cry. It is ours too. It must be ours." That became the rallying cry for the young people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We put that slogan, "One man, one vote," on our letterhead, on the back of the envelopes. And all of the writings publications that we sent out. Because of what happened in Birmingham, and you're so right, we went into Selma with the encouragement of Diane and Belva, but Bernard Lafayette had gone there even a little earlier, back in 1962, and Selma was a very tough place. In Selma and Dallas County, only about 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. And the only place you could attempt to register to vote was at the Dallas County Courthouse. And the only time that you could attempt to register to vote was on the first and third Mondays of each month. You had to pass a so-called literacy test. And on occasion, black men and black women, not just in Selma, but other parts of Alabama and the South, was asked to interpret certain section of the Constitution of the state of Alabama or Mississippi. And people would fail the so-called literacy test. There were black college professors, lawyers, doctors, and they just failed the test. On one occasion, a man was asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. On another occasion, a man was asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. So day in and day out, people would go down to the courthouse, and the registrar would put up a sign saying the registrar office is closed. And I recall very well, on October the 8th, 1963, we had Freedom Day in Selma, when about 60 people lined up trying to go into the courthouse, go through a set of double doors, and get a copy of the so-called literacy test, and they were denied. And I believe Lillian Gregory, the wife of Dick Gregory, came down as an observer, James Baldwin, and Howard Zinn, the historian. Mm-hmm. And most of us got arrested and went to jail. But at the same time, we were trying to organize the Mississippi Summer Project in the state of Mississippi, where we brought down more than 1,000 students, lawyers, doctors, ministers, priests, rabbis, and nuns. And you know very well that summer, 3 of our colleagues, 3 young men, who went out to investigate the burning of an African-American church, stopped by the sheriff, later taken to jail. And that same Sunday night, June 21st, 1964, they were taken out of jail, turned over to the Klan, where they were beaten, shot, and killed. It was a very sad and dark hour for the movement, but we didn't give up. That summer, July 2nd, 64, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And that was a great day for the signing of the act. And we challenged the seating of the Mississippi Freedom, the Mississippi delegation at the Democratic Convention. And later we challenged the seating of the Mississippi Congressional delegation in January 1965. But after Dr. King, and you're so right, after Dr. King had received the Nobel Peace Prize, he came back to Washington, had a meeting with President Johnson, told the president we needed a strong voting rights act. And the president said in so many words, Dr. King, we don't have the votes in the Congress to get a voting rights act. I just signed a Civil Rights Act. And Dr. King made a decision against, you're so right, against the wishes and feeling of some of the people on the SCLC board and some of the staff to join the movement in Selma. And he came to Selma. And I would never, ever forget those early days in January when he came. He galvanized, he mobilized, just his presence. And one day, when it was my day to lead a group of people down to the courthouse, to be exact, was January the 18th, 1965, Sheriff Clark was this very big man. I think both white and black in Selma were afraid of this guy. He was mean. I think he was born mean. He got up every morning mean. He wore a gun on one side, a nightstick on the other side, and he carried an electric cat powder in his hand, and he didn't use it on cows. He looked at me. It was about maybe 25 or 30 of us, local people from Selma, and he said, John Lewis, you're an outside agitator. You're the lowest form of humanity. And I said, Sheriff, I may be an agitator, but I'm not an outsider. I grew up only 90 miles from here, and we're going to stay here until these people are allowed to register to vote. and he arrested all of us. We went to jail. And those demonstrations, as you stated, continue, and they continue. And then on one night in February, well, Dr. King came, and he got arrested with 300 people. We filled the city jail, the county jail, elementary schools, children, middle school, high school, college kids, ministers, lawyers, doctors, everybody just went to jail in Selma. And we created a mass movement there. But then a few days later, in a little town called Marion, Alabama, the hometown of Coretta Scott King, the home county of Mrs. Andrew Young, Jean Young, home county of Mrs. Abernathy, Juanita Abernathy, Perry County, a young man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson was involved in a march, and a confrontation occurred at the courthouse. He tried to protect his mother. He was shot in the stomach by a state trooper. And because of what happened to him, he died a few days later at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma. Because of what happened to him, we made a decision. The movement did. The SCLC staff, to march from Selma to Montgomery. And the SNCC people said, we're not going to be part of this. This is SCLC march. We're not going to get all these people arrested in jail and maybe hurt. And so we conferred in Atlanta all night whether we should march or not. And I made the decision that I was a native of Alabama. I've been arrested in jail and with the people in Selma. They want to march, I'm going to go there and march with them. And 3 of the SNCC staffers, including myself, went there. And the rest is history.
3 of the SNCC staffers went. Now, I want to make 2 points about that. One is that 2 of the SNCC staffers had to go because you didn't have a driver's license and you didn't have a way of getting there unless somebody drove you. So you asked somebody to drive you there. So that is a light point. But the heavy point is that you did go there against, there was a lot of friction in this meeting. Most people did not want you to go for SNCC, for I don't know what you would call it. The head of the organization had to go against his whole organization in order just to take part in that march. So that's the inner dynamics of this. To be a leadership, have a leadership position in an avant-garde organization in the middle of a social revolution is never a comfortable moment. The movement was about people in conflict with themselves. And you had to make that decision at the risk of some of your colleagues and some of your friends, and you did it anyway.
Well, Taylor, I think I have what I call an executive session with myself. And I said I'm going to do it. Yeah. And I did it. I felt like it was a calling, and I wanted to be there. I wanted to be part of this effort. To make it possible for people to be able to participate in the democratic process.
So another point to make just about the history, because we're going to come to the end of the history point, all of those things that you're talking about, the marches in January and February when the children were run out into the countryside, arrested by the sheriff, took place before there was really a whole lot of public attention about what was going on in Selma. One of the ones that meant the most to me doing interviews was early on, it may have been in January, I don't have the exact date, but when I was interviewing former kids in Selma, they said the most amazing thing to them was the day the teachers marched. The Selma black public teachers all marched and came up to Brown Chapel and held up their toothbrushes because that meant that they were expecting to go to jail. And the kids, it was not a normal thing in the movement for school teachers who were a relatively privileged class to accept the risk. And were you there for that day?
I was there. That was a turning point. When little children saw their teachers marching, it created such a sense of togetherness and a sense of solidarity in the entire community, not just the young people, not just the children, but the parents and others supported that effort. That was the turning point when you saw the teachers marching.
So such a remarkable thing that the Voting Rights Act nationally, the voting rights movement, it had been going on, as you rightly point out, for a long time, but it had been concentrated there in Selma, and nobody was really paying attention to it until Bloody Sunday, which is a great question for us today. When is the notion that great new constitutional footholds in freedom is possible, when does that take hold? Because it was not national. Nobody was expecting this to have fruition all through January and February when these people are suffering and when these great things are going. But then after Selma, it happened. I mean, after Bloody Sunday.
But I think someplace along the way, Dr. King, in his own mind, said we would write that act. We would write it on the streets of Selma. And he was determined.
He said that in public, which is remarkable to me because it turned out to be true. It's a historian's enigma in question whether he really believed it. Some of the most significant discussions I've had since my writing is with graduate students on the interpretation of the letter from Birmingham jail. If you read that letter, there are two ways you can read it. One is a cri de coeur of somebody who expects the movement to be going down the tubes because Birmingham, nobody was paying any attention to it. And the other way is to say, I believe in the cause so much that this movement is going to succeed. What is the what is the? He said though we are going to write a Voting Rights Act on the streets of Selma, and it turned out to be true. But for most of the time he was there, it didn't look like it was going to be true. It was a true miracle.
But I think it's in keeping with the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence, to be hopeful, to be optimistic, but to somehow to believe that some way it's going to happen. It's all going to work out. You just have to be consistent and persistent.
Let me ask you a couple of, once the great breakthrough occurs at Pettus Bridge and Dr. King that night, when you were suffering from your concussion, that very night he sent out telegrams all over the country saying, please, we need help. Come to Selma. Don't write a letter to your congressman. He didn't say come to Selma in 6 months for a convention. He said come to Selma tomorrow and march. And people from all over the country came, including some that were killed there, like James Reeb, came into Selma. So it really was a catalytic point. The movement changed. The whole country got involved. The media got involved. But I wanted to ask you, during that period when you had the big marches and the final march into Montgomery, there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes in the movement, in the Congress people about what kind of bill would be written, the judge whether judge would allow this march to take place, with the executive branch about what kind of bill would be introduced. Were you aware of? I mean, the movement is not just about demonstrations and holding the movement together, although that was really hard to do. It's also about, what's your relationship with the executive branch and the judiciary. You're really getting into historic politics as well as a movement then. What's your memory of that kind of thing?
Well, I think those of us on the front line spend a great deal of our time dealing with the judiciary, especially the Department of Justice, but also with Judge Johnson, Frank M. Johnson, who had issued an order, an injunction saying that we could not march, and we had to go into federal court, into the district court there in Montgomery. And I remember being there and testifying. I had been there once before in 1961 during the Freedom Ride, and Judge Johnson was very progressive, very progressive. He had been appointed to the bench at a very young age by President Eisenhower. He was one of these progressive Republicans from northern Alabama. And I remember when John Doerr from the Civil Rights Division and others had subpoenaed the film footage of CBS of when we were being beaten, and they showed it in the courtroom. And Judge Johnson, we had asked, this when we were getting permission to march, getting the order to march. And George Johnson stood up after seeing that film footage, shook his robe, and recessed the court. And you knew then, you can just tell by his demeanor, he didn't like it.
No.
And he came back and gave us everything that we had asked for, that we could walk in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. He said, in effect, that we had a right to march. And
through Lowndes County.
Through Lowndes County. Now, Lowndes County, Alabama is located, it's between Selma and Montgomery. The county was more than 80% African American. There was not a single registered African American voter in the county.
Not one.
Not one. And we had to march through that county. But President Johnson had invited Governor Wallace to come to Washington, meet with him at the White House, to try to get assurance that he would be able to protect us. He could not assure the president. So on March 15th, 8 days after Bloody Sunday, President Lyndon Johnson, made one of the most meaningful speeches that any American president, I think, you may disagree with me, Taylor, had made in modern time on the whole question of voting rights or civil rights. He started that speech off that night by saying, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the destiny of democracy." To paraphrase what Lyndon Johnson said, he said, "At time, history, and fate meet in a single place in man's unending search for freedom. So it was more than a century ago at Lexington and at Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama." He condemned the violence in Selma. He introduced the Voting Rights Act, and before he concluded that speech, President Johnson said, "And we shall overcome." I was in the room with Dr. King at a local family home in Selma. I looked at him. Tears came down his face. He started crying, and we all cried. To hear Lyndon Johnson use the theme song of the Civil Rights Movement, he said, "And we shall overcome." Dr. King said then, "We will make it from Selma. The Voting Rights Act would be passed." And he was right.
The president's mentor and patron, Senator Russell from Georgia, was on the floor that day, and when he said, "We shall overcome," he had a different, stunned reply. All he said was, "God damn." I guess we're not on television, that's all right, but it was a stunning moment. Another one from behind the scenes is that when Judge Johnson was considering privately what kind of order to grant protecting the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, after John's testimony, Dr. King, he felt that he had the dignity of the judicial system to uphold, because his greatest nightmare was that he would have an order and that Governor Wallace would defy it and come in and beat the people on the march, and it would make him look ridiculous. So he called the acting Attorney General of the United States, Nicholas Katzenbach, and said, "If I issue an order protecting this, or I want assurances that you will enforce it, that if Wallace doesn't protect him, that you will." And Katzenbach said, "Yes, Your Honor, I'm sure that I will do everything I can." And the judge said to Katzenbach, "I don't give a damn what you think. I want to know what the President of the United States is going to do, and I want his assurance that he will protect these markets." So on a number of different occasions and moments, there were tests for lots of actors in this thing, in all three branches of government and the movements. So historically, to me, what's so significant about this is that it brings together an aroused citizenry with a responsive government. And not all of them are leaders at all the same time. One of the great things about Dr. King was that he said there were times when the students were ahead of him on what to do in the movement. So there's ebb and flow there, but you need to get everybody involved to do it. And there's a wonderful phone conversation, if you ever have a chance to listen to it, between Dr. King and Johnson after all this, in the summer, around the time the Voting Rights Act was signed, in which they were reminiscing, and Johnson said, "That was the greatest thing that ever happened. I know I told you to wait a little while on the Voting Rights Act because we didn't have the votes. But because you went in there and got the whole country involved through this witness and through those marches, I could stand up and propose this bill on the floor of the Congress, and So we work together like that, and that's what politics is about in its height. And so that truly is a remarkable historical moment, and underneath all of it is the notion that through politics you can do something positive to change not just everyday conditions or anything like, but to change the realities of people's lives. And that notion is, to some degree, severely atrophied today, that politics has this kind of noble possibility that we can address problems that severe, that entrenched as racism and the right to vote in 1965. So we need to do everything we can to restore that. Now, John, you were there. Were you there for the signing of the Voting Rights?
I was there. I was there. As a matter of fact,
it was up in the House, right? It wasn't in the White House.
At the House, and matter of fact, Senator Kennedy showed me at the desk after the last renewal of the Act that Lyndon Johnson used to sign the Act. And a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I saw for the first time a clip from a CBS footage of President Johnson presenting me one of the pens that he used to sign the Act. It was an unbelievable day, Taylor. It was on August 6, 1965. But for some reason to this day, and maybe I should ask, maybe you should as a historian, should ask this question. The morning that Lyndon Johnson signed the Act, he invited James Farmer, Okor, and myself, along with 1 or 2 people from SNCC, to meet with him to talk about what we should do to implement it. Now, you know President Johnson had some very classic words and phrases that he would use. And some I cannot say it before this audience, but he was telling us how to go back to the South and do this and do that and you know, get these folks by the, you know what, and
truly,
and implement this Act.
Looking forward, always looking forward. Because he knew it was going to be a great test just to implement this Act, and it was. It didn't have very many. You didn't have very many federal inspectors. It was very, very difficult. He also, another thing that was interesting, slightly off the Voting Rights Act, when he came out of signing it, there are several people that I talked to, members of Congress, including Senator Kennedy, who said that on his way out of signing the Voting Rights Act, he buttonholed Senator Kennedy and said, "Where is my goddamn immigration bill?" Because Johnson wanted to pass the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, which I call the third great Civil Rights Act, but it's largely unrecognized as a Civil Rights Act because it didn't have the normal demonstrations and the recognition of what it did. But it was, he said, basically, we beat the Southerners on cloture with the Voting Rights Act. We can beat them again, but only for a couple of months to get the Immigration Bill Act that repealed the national origins test for legal immigration in the United States. Had an enormous effect on this country. And it's just 2 months later that he's standing up at the Statue of Liberty saying that he was repealing the national, it was first come, first served for legal immigrants, and never again will the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege shadow the gate to freedom. Largely unrecognized. So this is a truly amazing period of history where you've got citizens' movements, executive branch, judges, all involved at the very, very core element of democracy, which is the vote.
I think it represented one of the finest hours in our democracy, really. You know, a few days, just 2 or 3 days after Bloody Sunday, by that Tuesday, there was demonstration in more than 80 major cities in America.
Yeah.
At the White House, at the Department of Justice, almost every major college campus, the American people were demanding that the Congress, that the president act. And this president, Lyndon Johnson, acted. He called out the military to protect us all the way from Selma to Montgomery. I remember some nights there in Selma before we marched, the young people, the children, there was a rope, and they were talking about the Berlin Wall in Selma. There's a wall in Berlin. There's a wall in Selma. And somehow he made it happen.
I'd like to shift ground now to the future. We've talked about the history, how the Voting Rights Act came about, the actors involved, the history involved. You can't relive this history without reliving the sense of possibility, the sense of what politics is about. And now here we are, the Voting Rights Act has been renewed, 4 or 5 times, and we're still fighting over the Voting Rights Act. From your position now, now in Congress, now as a member of the leadership in your party, how does the future of the Voting Rights Act and the voting rights issue look to you?
Well, as a nation and as a party, as a Democrat, but as a citizen of America, we need to open up the process and let the people come in. There's still too many barriers to open and free participation in the democratic process.
Now, is that a live issue in the Congress, do you think, or?
It may not be. You know, here in the District of Columbia, it's a shame and a disgrace that the people here do not have full participation in the political process.
Amen.
That's a blight on our democracy. It just shouldn't happen. It just shouldn't keep. But even in other places in America, we still make it so hard and so difficult for people to participate. This whole business of registration, and in some states, people become much more open, much more progressive in saying that you register and vote on the same day. You can do it. Why don't we make, as Jimmy Carter once suggested, make participating in the political process as simple as picking up a glass and getting a drink of water. We still set up barriers. It's the way we put people through hoops and loops. It's obsolete.
Well, let me ask you this. It may be a more difficult question here, because this panel, I listened to the panel this morning about the Voting Rights Act and the issues involving Section 2, Section 5, challenges, a new round of reapportionment coming up from this year's census. The overwhelming sensation that you got was that the purpose of the people here is to defend the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Ironically, if you're talking about progressives trying to extend the franchise and get more people involved, as you're saying, we've gone from a position in 1965 of looking ahead of things that don't exist to now defending something that is 40 years old. Is that a healthy position, or do some of, in other words, is there a disadvantage in our major effort being defending something that's 45 years old instead of imagining the next step to take?
Well, I think there's some fear in certain quarters, even in the Congress, and maybe with some of the private organizations, maybe even with the Department of Justice. I know a lot of individuals here, staffers from the Department of Justice, from the voting rights section. I think that the fear that if we push too hard, that certain section may be challenged, may be thrown out and declared unconstitutional, whether Section 2 or Section 5. I know this in recent days that seemed like there's been this eagerness, not eagerness, but maybe the readiness to say, oh, we won't fight that. We just let Georgia have that so-called ID requirement. I think that's a form of a literacy test, in my estimation. They said to people in Georgia, said to senior citizens, said to people who live in the mountains of Georgia, rural areas, people who never had a driving license, maybe never had an ID, or to question somebody whether you're a citizen or not, because you may look like someone from of another ethnic group. And so you got to show your ID, you got to prove that you're a citizen before you can cast your vote?
Well, I guess...
Just open up the process. Let the people come in.
I know, but in order to make that happen, we seem to be deployed defending the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and there's some who say we have all we can say grace over to do that because there are all these new challenges. If you're an army that is fighting hard, can you possibly afford to deploy part of your army to imagine the next Voting Rights Act? A Voting Rights Act in light of the fact that we no longer have paper ballots and it may not be necessary to vote on a Tuesday and only one day, and how do you make sure that everybody's vote is not only counted but encouraged and counted equally?
Taylor, I think we got to fight on all fronts, both fronts. Preserve what we have, but strengthen it.
Right.
Broaden it. Don't be afraid.
Thank you.
This is the 21st century.
It really is.
And with the technology that we have, we should be able to do better as a nation and as a people.
And this organization here, as I understand it, was formed in part out of the constitutional and voting issues growing out of the 2000 election, many of which to this day have not been addressed, about ballot design, registration, all of these things.
Ballot security, whether you can steal, whether some person's vote is really what that person meant, whether you get an accurate count.
So that is it possible to design a system that will make it more possible for everybody's vote to count and for it to count equally and for it to be encouraged? Because if we're saying that essentially the vote is the raw material of democracy, that's what the whole architecture is built around the vote, then it seems to me that the health of democracy is how many people are voting and what kind of confidence we have that those votes are counted fairly and that we can make forward progress beyond the Voting Rights Act, which, after all, was designed to prevent and to deal with systematic repression by race. I mean, the very reason that civil rights movement is called a civil rights movement is applied commonly to black folks is because their rights were the ones most commonly abridged, right?
But it's everybody.
But it's everybody.
It's everybody's civil
So
right.
Open it up. When you say open it up, you mean open it up to everybody.
Everybody.
Everybody's vote counts.
Every person.
Mm-hmm.
One person, one vote.
Mm-hmm.
And every person's vote should count.
And
no person should be left out or left behind when it comes to participating in our democracy. And we still have devices and ways to keep people from fully participating.
Well, I hope maybe that some of the minds here today can spend some of their time in trying to apply that principle, that nobody's vote should be discouraged, to a future act, because the peculiarities of the Voting Rights Act, it seems to me as a historian, are going to make it look more peculiar as time goes by, that it applies only in certain places and this, that, and the other, and that a universal act that applies to everybody, that applies in Alaska and as well as in Massachusetts and Mississippi, is something that would be worthwhile trying to develop.
Well, maybe scholars and legal experts, constitutional lawyers.
Lawyers and maybe even some street people and teachers and demonstrators and people who care about the right to vote, because that's what...
Like we did during another period.
Like you did back then. Well, I'd like to throw it open to questions now, unless you had something else you wanted to say about this period now, looking back on it, John? I mean...
Well, as I was trying to suggest earlier, I think the period that we came through to get the Voting Rights Act was one of the finest periods in modern American history. It was a people's effort, a people's movement. The president wanted to say no, but the people said yes. And they got a president to say yes. And a Congress to say yes. President
and a Congress to say yes. And the complexity of politics, because there were times when Johnson, you can hear him on his phone conversation say, well, I want to come out there and shock them with how far I'm willing to go, but not yet. Let them make me do it, because that will build up political support. So there's kind of a tactile sense of what's possible in politics that a professional politician, in the best sense of the word, can use to advance democracy. And I think that was, as you say, one case where it happened, where it was the best in the citizens meeting and bringing out the best in the politicians. Because it took everybody to make this happen.
Well, I mean.
Yeah. So, do we have questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Are there microphones or? Oh.
Is it on? Yes. My name is Asa Gordon. Actually, there is one way to look at the future is to look beyond the Voting Rights Act to the past. And in fact, there's a civil action pending in the U.S. Court of Appeals. It's me, Gordon versus Biden, to enforce the second section of the 14th Amendment. As it turns out, there are 24 states, John, that award their presidential electors on a winner-take-all basis that is not based on state law, state statute. The suit is simple. It says it's focused on the 7 states that do this because they are subject to, Title V, what they call Section 5. And in those states, they don't have a winner-take-all statute, but they're awarded on a winner-take-all basis. And the suit says simple. In those states, you must apportion on a proportional basis. If you do that, blacks account for 15 electoral votes as opposed to 0 in those states. There's no law, state statute. Now, my question is, why are not progressive legal organizations trying to, now I'm forcing Section 2, which penalizes the state by reducing representation, so I understand why lawyers don't want to do that. My question is, could Title V be used if they want to take the safe route? I'm taking the bad route. I'm saying you got to lose representation. That's what the Section 2 says. It's Title 2, Section 2, USC, Section 6. It's called reduction of representation, which punishes the former Confederate states, and they did it. They get the 14th Amendment passed. They actually reduced the representation. Now, if they didn't let the freed slaves, right, can the 65 Voting Rights Act be used under the principle of one man, one vote, and say that in those states where there's no winner-take-all statute, you must apportion on a proportional basis. The default can't be winner-take-all because you disfranchise or you bridge the right of those who vote for the minority candidate.
I don't know. There are several individuals here from the Department of Justice who work in Section 5. I think some people in the Congress and some others around the country, lawyers and others and organizations, they're very nervous about, correct me here, with the Supreme Court, and that we don't want the Section 5 to be declared unconstitutional, right?
But the larger point from the question, or however you come out on that, is that among the many other things that need to be rethought in the whole notion of opening up the process, making every vote count fairly and count equally, is that we still have an electoral college. And almost nobody defends the electoral college, but we can't, or the electrical college, but we can't come to an agreement on what the fairest and most democratic replacement is right now.
Proportional apportionment predicated on a popular split where
Yeah.
there's no law to the contrary.
Yeah.
That would democratize half of the states. Unfortunately, I'm going to be frank with you, many lawyers are not even aware of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. That's what I find out and talking about today. That's an embarrassment. But I would like to give you the history of that.
All right, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Jim Flug. I was in the room with Nick Katzenbach while all this was going on. So I'd very much appreciate it if John could talk a little bit about what you opened up, which was the role of the Justice Department and the people at every level in the Justice Department, especially the lawyers in the Civil Rights Division, at a time when the Civil Rights Division is still under attack from as a leftover from the Bush administration, and what's left of the Civil Rights Commission isn't operating the way it was supposed to. Can you harken back to those days when the Justice Department was in the forefront and the people in the Civil Rights Division were right down there with you in Selma?
Well, the Justice Department during those days played a major role without question. Individuals like John Doe, Britt Marshall, we could talk with those guys. And if it hadn't been for John Doe, hadn't been for Robert Kennedy during the Freedom Ride, when we were trapped in that church in Montgomery on the night of May 21st, 1961, some of us probably would have died. I probably wouldn't be sitting here. Hadn't been for people like the late governor of Florida, Leroy Collins, the former governor, who was there with the Community Relations Service. And some of those guys they walked every step that we walked. They were there. The lawyers from the Department of Justice. They was not just sitting in Washington, but they were out in the field. Now, there may be another question with the FBI and the role they played. but there were some brave and courageous men and women, mostly men, because you didn't have that many women out front. Well, the Department of Justice, I guess, like other parts of the federal government, just didn't have a lot of women like you have today. But the Lord, they were there in the courtroom, walking all the way with us from Selma to Montgomery.
And the Irishmen leading the marshals?
Yes.
Jimmy McShane? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, you mentioned the FBI. I think as a historical corrective, even the FBI at the time was considered a heck of a lot better if the alternative is the local sheriff.
Right.
So when you see the FBI as bad as it was, it's not as bad as we think of it now, because we are so accustomed to looking back at history through to a large degree phony notions of J. Edgar Hoover in pantaloons or pom-poms or all that stuff. That wasn't true. I mean, and therefore the story just recently about Ernest Withers,
Yeah, the photographer.
that's not that scandalous. I mean, it may be scandalous to get paid, but there were a lot of people who felt that if you want the FBI to come bail you out when you're not going to call the sheriff, because the sheriff is the one who's orchestrating the lynching, then you better have a good relationship with your local FBI agent. So let's have a little historical. The whole federal government was considered, by and large, a refuge, and people like John Doe, who were down there and out in meetings and going and in demonstration, not in them, but monitoring them, and there on the spot were positively heroic.
No, I agree with you, Taylor. I agree. On one occasion, I think it was John Doe in Birmingham and also in Jackson, Mississippi, probably saved the day by he was tall, he could be seen, and he just stood up and just waved his hand, separated crowds. It was just unbelievable.
Yes, sir. Yes.
I'm Jim Dixon.
I'm sorry. I called on somebody else, but I'll call on you next. I'm sorry.
I have a question, but first, I know that footnoting Taylor on history is really bringing coals to Newcastle. But in terms of the Congress, while there's no question that Selma and the bravery made the Voting Rights Act possible, I think it should be noted that as soon as Title V of the '64 Act, which was the voting rights title, had to be dropped, very strong champions like Phil Hart, who was managing it, Paul Douglas, Javits, Ted Kennedy, immediately started planning for having a separate bill to restore that. And Phil Hart then became the manager of the 65 Act. So there were people in Congress, although some made it possible, who were determined from before that to get the act. My question is, now that, thanks to Ted Kennedy, we have the 18-year-old vote, what you think of the idea in terms of trying to expand to the maximum, one man, everybody voting, of a bill that would say, like you used to be at 18, become part of the draft, and I think you still have to register, that it was incumbent on the officials to give a voting card or register for the vote, everyone who's a citizen, upon becoming 18. And then if people object to that because of concern about immigration, then you could maybe fall back to that, to a lot of the other changes you were talking about extended voting and making it easier. But that would very clearly lay out the notion that when you're 18, you ought to be able to vote.
What do you think, John?
I wouldn't have any problem with it. I think that's one way to open up the process. That would be a significant step.
There's so many things to work on about doing what John says is the goal, which is to open up the process, have everybody vote, have everybody's vote count fairly and accurately. That would be a good step. And we've got all these obvious problems to deal with, and not obvious answers. I'm not saying the answers are obvious. I think the best thing is when we don't know what the answer is, because then we're arguing and we try to base whatever answers we're proposing on the broadest possible principles that John enunciated.
That would get you there.
Yeah.
And you might have to have a fail-safe for people who weren't registered. They could come in and then register, but basically the government would have to register everybody when they became 18. You wouldn't have to take these half steps.
Well, I know it would never happen. What I'm about to suggest would never happen. But having studied the problems of America's treatment of young people through schools and other things where young people are always at the bottom end of everything, one possible reform that won't happen would be to lower the voting age to about 12. If you lowered the voting age to 12, it would change a lot of things about children's services and the quality of schools in this country. Oh, yes, Mr. Dixon.
Right. I'm Jim Dixon with the American Association of People with Disabilities. Thank you both for your leadership and your courage. You've done a lot for the country, and you've done a lot for me. It was FDR, a president who also had a disability, who said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." I think that, Mr. Branch, your observation that we're on the defensive is absolutely right. And life in politics is not baseball. It's not defense that wins. It's offense. The disability community played a key role in the passage of NVRA. We broke the filibuster. It was the disability community that put mandates in HAVA when a lot of our civil rights colleagues said we couldn't even bring up the word. I think we need to think about an omnibus piece of legislation that puts a disability face on it, that addresses one person, one vote in all its ramifications, and most importantly, and I learned this from your books, Mr. Branch, the legislation that we design needs to be designed so that it will provoke a reaction in a way that that reaction can be used to create the political will to pass it. And I would encourage this organization to convene people to try to figure that out. And I'd like to know what each of you think of that idea.
My simple point would be we shouldn't be afraid. we should be courageous. And we believe in something, we should go for it. We should be daring. During the 60s, we didn't have a website. we didn't have an iPod, Facebook. We believe in something and we went for it. We did what I call putting oneself in the way. And if you believe that something is possible, create the climate, create the environment, get the educate, sensitize the American people, and get the American people to get the President of the United States, to get the Congress to move, to act. I just think today in America, we're too quiet. We're just too darn quiet. And we need to push and pull and make some noise. The other side, the people who want to go back or stand still, they're making all of the noise. We need to make some noise. Just go for it.
I agree. The only point I would make, aside from the notion that I think you might possibly call it the We the People Omnibus Act, grounding it in what we the people means electorally, is that don't underestimate the magnitude of that task. I think that it's something that's going to need task forces to debate various things like registration, apportionment, the Electoral College, voting rights for the District of Columbia. There are a lot of complicated, difficult issues where we probably wouldn't all agree. But if we hashed it out on the basis of the principles we were talking about, I think that it wouldn't take long to get a draft that would excite reaction, which is what John is saying. So I endorse the notion. It is a significant undertaking, and it's like setting out on a long road, but I think that it's a positive road. Yes, sir, in the back.
First of all, both of you for taking us down memory lane a little bit. I worked in the early 1970s for SCLC and helped to register African Americans and get them to the polls. And so your stories resonate to a certain extent from both of you, so thank you. I have a question about something that happened on Friday, and I'd like to direct it to the Congressman, but Mr. Branch, if you'd like to comment on it, you certainly can. On Friday, Christopher Coates, who was a former head of the Voting Rights Division at the Department of Justice and an ACLU award winner, told the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that he had found a pervasive hostility toward what he called race-neutral enforcement of the civil rights laws. He particularly addressed the issue of the Ike Brown case and the new Black Panther case, as where the whites were victims and blacks were allegedly the perpetrators of wrongdoing. Sir, do you embrace what Mr. Coates has to say? Do you believe that there needs to be, though, a race-neutral enforcement of the law?
Well, I don't know enough about the case. I have not followed the case. I have never, ever considered the old Black Panther or the new Black Panther a part of the civil rights movement. I leave it like this, sir. Thank you.
I don't know anything about it either. Yes, sir, in the back.
I'd like to ask this question both to get a reaction from a historical and a legislative point of view. I've been in foreign countries when they've been having an election, and they're horrified when they ask me, and I tell them maybe 2/3 of the registered voters or eligible voters vote in the U.S., and in some of these countries, they have the obligation of voting just like we have jury duty. You must vote, and if you don't, officials want to know why. It turns it on its head, but maybe that would give a system like that would give the Civil Rights Division a reason to find out who is either obstructing voting or why people can't get to the polls, whether they be handicapped, aged, very rural, and there's no convenient voting booth or whatever. Has there ever been any discussion within the movement historically or in Congress to make it an obligation so that we did have 95 or 99+% of the people either voting or explaining why they're not, which would get rid of all these issues about, is it race-based that you're not voting? Is it convenience? Is it handicap? Vote, just like you do jury duty.
Well, I'm afraid if a lot of people vote just like they do jury duty, there won't be a lot of no-shows. But the principle, I understand. What do you think, John? I don't know. I don't think you can force people to vote, but I think maybe you could force people to aggressively not vote, to say, I choose not to vote, rather than just ignore the whole process, which is what we have now. But at least that's another thing to throw into our task force.
Well, I just think, in our history of our country and our whole struggle as a nation and as a people to create a more perfect union and to create a sense of what I like to call one America, one house, one family, the American house, the American family, that it should be this call and this sense of mission, this sense of obligation that I want to participate, that I want to vote, that is so precious. It is so important. And I'm not so sure that you should, but something that we should discuss and debate, but that you should have a law saying that you must go out and vote. I have this feeling that if a dog catcher is running, and I got to go out and vote, I got to go out and participate. I mean, I go for that dog catcher. I may write somebody's name in there or something. But it's this feeling, this obligation, this sense that people died for this right, and you must exercise it. But I'm not so sure that a state or the federal government should have a mandate. But it is a shame and a disgrace in a country such as America that so few people participate.
Well, on that note, both the positive note and the note of caution, we have a lot to do, and I think we need to draw things to a close here and move on to another panel. Somebody else will make the announcement about the next panel. But I want to thank John. It is a great privilege to call you honorable and to have had this many years in association in your career and in this cause, and to discuss it here with all of you today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.